So welcome everyone. I have just the same announcement I've always been making, which is that on Thursday the 29th, we're having a set of visitors for our external review. So please keep that date open. Graduate students are scheduled, I believe, for something like 11:15 to lunch on that day, and then there's going to be, everybody's invited to lunch that day. The more the merrier. We're going to have box lunches. So everyone is invited. Today we're delighted to have Gary Gates from the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School. Gary does a lot of demographic work, but he's an expert more broadly on the demographic, geographic, and economic characteristics of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender populations. It's not often that we get a speaker whose research recently made a difference in national law and public policy. So, because Gary's work was actually cited in the recent Supreme Court case on same-sex marriage. So he has a background in public policy and also divinity and computer science. Yes. Wonderful combination. Computer science.
A combination that requires cocktails to explain.
And today he's going to talk about doing family research in public on the LGBT community. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I think it's been 4 or 5 years since I've been back to Berkeley, so it's great to be here. For those of you who don't know the Williams Institute, we're a research center at UCLA. We're part of the School of Law. Our staff is a group of social science researchers and legal researchers, and we do sexual orientation and gender identity law and policy work. So it gives me a kind of interesting vantage point from there that's a little different than being on a faculty having lots of teaching responsibilities, because there's this very intention in my position that that my work is supposed to be very engaged with the policy discourse. And obviously over the last 10 years, the fact that I was doing a lot of work around LGBT people, particularly same-sex couples, using Census Bureau data meant that my work, there was this clear salience. But what I want to talk about today is, I do want to just kind of talk a little bit about my work and describe some of the more recent findings around LGBT families and family research. But I want to frame it around this idea of how this plays out when it does kind of get into what I'm calling the public square. And I think in particular, as academics, I think we like the idea of our research being used by policymakers, and when you talk about that, everybody thinks that's a great idea, that people actually use your work and that it changes things and matters. But I think the Academy does very poorly at training scholars to maneuver that world, particularly, and this is what I'm going to talk here, particularly when that policy world intersects substantially with the courts. The courts are a very strange place for academic research, to try to talk about academic research. It's an odd environment to do that. And so that's what I'm going to talk. I'll talk first just about some of my findings, but then I had the distinct honor to serve as an expert witness on the Boer versus Schneider trial, which was the Michigan trial. So it's the other trial. Not the Prop 8 one. It was the other marriage trial that actually, and that one went to the Supreme Court. That was one of the 4 cases in the Supreme Court. So I'm going to use that as my framework to talk a little bit about how the work that I'm going to show you then got translated inside the courtroom. So about in 2011, I put out, this is like a 6 or 7 page paper in which it was the first time I realized we had like 4 or 5 nationally representative surveys that measured sexual orientation. And I thought, okay, I'm just gonna do a little paper that talks about them and just averages across them to say, we think this is the percentage of people who identify as LGBT. And a couple of them had other measures like sexual behavior and sexual attraction, and so I used them as well. And I had 2 small state surveys that measure gender identity. So I came out with these estimates, and the estimate that was 3.5% of adults identify as LGBT, and maybe about 0.3% are transgender. So this was one of the moments where I really realized how crazy it can get. Because I was so careful to try to talk about other ways of measuring sexual orientation, but nonetheless, the major headline that came out from this in a piece, The Atlantic is a fairly big publication. Americans have no idea how few gay people there are. And so you'll note what they did here is first, apparently bisexuals don't count, because they didn't take the bisexual number. They only took the gay, lesbian number. They completely ignored, and lots of press completely ignored the bisexual number as if that's not really relevant. And all they wanted to talk about was how small it was. And for the record, in academic circles, none of this was surprising. Like, this was consistent with what has been being shown by that point. And we don't have tons of data, and we don't have tons of representative data, but it wasn't like wildly divergent. They were all around this kind of 2.5 to 3.5, sometimes 5% range, but it wasn't like these enormous differences. But it wasn't 1 in 10, which is the kind of mythical figure that everybody has in their heads. So my famous thing is Larry Kramer, who, if you don't know, he's a rather prominent LGBT activist, founded ACT UP and GMHC, and now Emmy winner, I believe, Tony winner, I think. But he says, this and everyone falls on their knees to kiss his feet, this Gary Gates person. Would that were true. Whatever the definition of us by behavior identity, there's far more of us than any present day methodology can ascertain. Go away, play with someone else's lives and hopes and futures, and shut up. So, but what this demonstrates is that for a long, and I actually think we finally started to turn the corner here, but for a long part of my career, the idea of measuring and demographically studying the LGBT population was much more threatening to LGBT people than it was to as much as the Academy thought it was weird to do, and I got the speeches about you're going to be too niche and you're not going to be able to, that kind of stuff certainly happened, but the people who were most threatened and the people who have always been the most critical of my work have always been from the inside. Virtually all of the nasty attacks on me, which, they're not, it's not like I mean bodyguards or anything, but there were definitely people who came after me, but they were all from the LGBT people from the movement. In fact, the right, to the degree that more conservative people used my work, they loved it because they loved the idea that there weren't very many. They thought that was a great message, so they would use my work in that way. And the fact that they used it actually helped me to kind of make the case that I'm objective. Because another challenging thing about doing work in this arena is that while I stand by my work and I want my work to meet, very rigorous scholarly standards, I also have an opinion on how this should be used, and I have an opinion on what I want the outcome to be. So that can be a delicate balance as well as to how to position your work in an environment where there's such heated debate. And I think we should remember that particularly around the marriage issue, it is a unique issue in the sense that it really was being debated at every level of our society. So it was being voted on, it was being debated in legislatures, it was in the court system, it was in corporate boardrooms. Almost every sphere of our society was kind of debating this issue in some way or another. So, how many LGBT people are there? So one of the challenges, I worked with the Gallup organization, who about 2.5 years ago started asking on their daily tracking survey a very simple single item question. Do you personally identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? And so every night and I think we should not underestimate how important this is. Every night in this country, 1,000 Americans have to answer that question. And most of them have never been asked that question.
How is it asked?
It's, do you personally identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? Yes or no?
By telephone?
By telephone. And in English and Spanish. And they do half cell and half landline currently. Though they're talking about trying to up the cell.
Is that deliberate that you're not separating those groups? So
The separated, yeah, yes. So so one of the challenges about measuring sexual orientation is that most people, the vast majority of the population don't know what their sexual orientation is. Heterosexuals don't know that they're heterosexual. They don't know the word heterosexual, they don't know the word straight. So when they have to choose with a bunch of options, they often get confused. And it creates false positive problems in measurement. So one of the solutions, for instance, that the National Institute of National Health Interview Survey came up with was that in their item, so they delineate it out, but they say straight, that is not gay. That's the actual item. And it's to give people a negative as opposed to an affirmative answer. My argument for the Gallup, so the Gallup question, the purpose of it was not to separate it out. It was to get a sense of who affiliates with this broad political and cultural group. And they wanted to minimize the that kind of false positive. And in this question, if you're not one of those, you just say no. So you either know what those mean, or if you don't, you probably say no. And that seems, but the truth is, even with all of our administrations over, we get very consistent answers. It's not that dramatic. But you do see on here that there is regional variation. And I wish I should have added the map. Just 2 days ago, Facebook did an analysis of who came out since the Obergefell decision. And they've tracked, and by coming out, it's people who either changed their own gender or changed the gender that they're attracted to. And coming out has accelerated since Obergefell. It's now almost twice, on a daily rate, it's now almost twice as high as it was a year ago. But they did a map of percentage of LGBT. It looked remarkably like this, including like really little subtle things. So so I think this is an anomaly. This is a statistical, it's a small sample. I think but even on the Facebook thing, South Dakota was higher than North Dakota, like by a decent amount. Nevada was high, actually slightly higher than California on the Facebook thing. So I always just get amused when those things sort of align in any way. But I also, yeah.
I'm wondering if there are other questions with these data that would make it possible to look at interstate migration.
Mm-hmm.
Get some notion whether these are reflecting selective migration or state.
So that you led right into what I was about to say, which is, so how much of this can we interpret as a preference for where people want to live, so kind of the migration issue, versus visibility of where people feel more comfortable being out. And I have not done detailed assessment, but the things that I can tell you in data are that so my belief is that the vast majority of this is willingness to be out, not substantial migration patterns. In the General Social Survey for the last 6 years, they asked a question of where you lived when you were age 16, and the percentage of LGBT people who live in the town, who live now in the town when they were age 16 is exactly the same as non-LGBT. So I don't believe that LGBT people were any more likely to move than other people. Their movement might be different. So among the ones that move, there might be differential patterns that consider social climate or legal climate. But that's actually not that big of a group. And the differences, I don't think, are as dramatic also as people think. Most people, when they move for employment and for a job, and it trumps everything else. Lots of studies have shown that. So if your choice is a job in Nebraska or move, unfettered to California, you probably take the job in Nebraska. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So you say you think it's more about the state that people are out. So
Yeah.
do you think that the responses to the survey are very much conditioned on being out in one's non-survey life?
Well, largely though not entirely. So we did a survey on the General Social Survey, and in fact Pew did a survey of LGBT people, and in both cases we asked people who had already identified as LGBT who they are out to. And consistently we get 5+% who say no one. So the only person they've, in theory, if they're telling you the truth, the only person they've ever told is the survey taker. And the Washington Post did a story on this recently. So
That's a small share.
it is a small share.
It's striking, but it
But
does
it's
align
not,
with your
right,
story.
but my point is I think most of it is comfortableness with being out. And the map just intuitively makes sense. Look, it's the Northeast and the West where you have higher percentages. That makes sense given what we know about social acceptance around LGBT issues. So it's not, and the Midwest is in the middle, like it is in everything else in this country. So and the South and so the really conservative parts of the country generally are low. So to me, it's intuitively, it fits. So one of the big changes that's been happening, and this is an interesting thing again in studying demographics of the LGBT population, is that this is a group that is incredibly dynamic because it's changing in terms of who comes out. Because the people who are coming out now are not the same demographically, the same people who came out 15 years ago. So this just shows social acceptance. So this is in the General Social Survey. This is the percent who think that same-sex sexual relationships is always wrong. So it's only in the last 4 years that went below majority status. And when we look at the opposite and look at not wrong at all, it's only in the last couple years that has approached majority status. But that those lines finally crossed in a different direction. That's only happened in the last couple years. But you do see that it was on a hold pattern kind of through up to the early 90s, but since the early 90s, we have seen markedly different speed of change than in the 70s and 80s. So this is using US Census data of same-sex couples, and I'll talk about in a minute about the one methodological thing I'm going to talk about, and it relates to the false positive problem. But we estimate, according to census, it's around 690,000. Gallup has started to try to figure out same-sex couples from their questions. So if you say yes to LGBT and you say you're married or living with someone, they ask you the sex of your partner, and so their estimate comes closer to 1 million same-sex couples. And I don't know. I actually believe that a little more, but because there are a bunch of problems with census put out. But anyway, this is just density. So same-sex couples per 1,000 households, and again, you see the same broad patterns. Really dark areas in the Northeast, in the West. I think you'll notice dark blotches. Two other patterns: dark blotches in almost every urban area, but also dark blotches in Native American areas. And I think what that's about is that, remember that census is a household survey where you have to identify how everyone's related to you. On Native American reservations, you have very large households, and so they're more complicated in general. And one of the errors that can happen is if the daughter is living with her boyfriend, and dad calls the boyfriend his unmarried partner, basically arguing that he's the unmarried partner of his daughter, but when it comes into the census, it looks like he's the father's unmarried partner. And if there's only a couple of those that happen just by mistake, there's not that many households, so you get this like high, and you do get it, like the northern part of Wisconsin, these are all Native American areas, so I think but that's really hard. I mean, it's so complicated to go into the records and figure that all out. But I think that's what's going on. And otherwise, I do think it looks very similar to the Gallup map. This is at a county level.
Why is it complicated to go into the records?
Well, it's not complicated, it just takes time. Because you really have to then look at age structures of everybody in the house and make some guesses about who might be you know, so it's just, you have to, the modeling of it, you have to think very carefully about. I did it last on like 1990 data and haven't really looked at it since. But it was kind of true in the 90 data. Because it also happens in areas with, you get a similar bump in areas with big Latino populations, and again, those tend to be disproportionately large households. So what's the challenge with couples? So you have all these different sex couples, you have this small group of same-sex couples. It turns out that some portion of the same-sex couples are actually comprised of different sex couples who make an error and code one of the sexes wrong of the couple. And that error could be as simple as an errant check mark. So when census had the boxes vertical, and so male, female for like the second person was vertical, and you could check, they in the next year in the ACS, they moved the boxes side by side. Their number of same-sex couples dropped by like 25%. And it was simply because the improvement in the sex rate. So this has been a really difficult problem because you can't, at a micro data level, you can't figure out who the errors are. We've come up with lots of ways to estimate how big the overall error is, but to then try to use the microdata where you feel confident that you have real same-sex couples, it gets really difficult and you have to make some judgment calls. So I've created this new thing where I do the following adjustment. So the main variables that I'm looking at are relationship to household or sex, marital status, and the year of marriage. If anybody's been allocated, meaning the census assigned that value, it wasn't the original, so it was a missing or whatever, I take them out. And then for married same-sex couples, I retain only those who they both give the same date of marriage, and that date is post-2004, which is when the first marriages started in the United States. It's theoretically possible that some people could have been married before that, but nonetheless, that's what I do. And so my short evidence for why I think this is a relatively good way to do this for now, and I'll explain for a minute how census is going to fix this so that we don't have to do all this. So this is my corrected sample. And if you look at the ratio of married same-sex couples to all married different-sex couples, you see that it's way higher in all of the states that had marriage at the time, that had legal same-sex marriage. And when you look at the sample that I took out, there's kind of like no connection, or a much, much weaker connection to having a same-sex marriage law. So this is one of my pieces of evidence that I think it's a reasonably good way to do it. The way the census is about to fix this, and God, this isn't happening until like 2019, even though it's been tested for the last 7 years. Instead of, right now you can call someone your husband, wife, or unmarried partner. In the 2020 decennial, and probably in the 2019 American Community Survey, the options will be opposite sex husband and wife, same sex husband and wife, opposite sex unmarried partner, same sex unmarried partner. So what that does, it doesn't completely eliminate the error, but it gives you way more information to make edits. And they can predict much more carefully where they think the error lies, and that's the studies they've been doing are confirming this. Coincidentally, Canada has been doing that since like 2001, and the UK has been doing it since because they knew about this error. But nonetheless, hopefully these kind of administrations that you have to go through with these data are only for the next few years. So not surprisingly, marriage among same-sex couples has risen dramatically. We don't have numbers post-Obergefell, but even when Windsor was passed, you saw this really big leap where people got federal recognition regardless of where they were. I will caution, these are based on different data sources. This is kind of using the American Community Survey, using that method that I showed you. And that was a number that Gallup collected right before the Supreme Court decision. So the challenge for any of you who know vital statistics in this country is we're not going to have good data on same-sex couples ever, because we don't have good marriage data, period. And lots of states, when they change their form, instead of, so all marriage licenses, almost all of them had husband and wife. They didn't actually ask your sex or your gender. So they just crossed out husband and wife and made it person one and person two. So now you don't know the sex or gender of the persons. Some states collect it, but it's not in any way consistent. And the American Community Survey, as you know, is quite lagged. So even though we probably in the long run could get some data off that, it's always 2 years behind. So you can't get contemporary numbers. Like, we're not going to get good numbers from the ACS to track the change since Obergefell until like 2017 almost, when the 2016 numbers come out. So so we don't have great data on this, and reporters hate me for that. So one of the things about same-sex couples that and we're going to talk about the parenting stuff, that there's a lot of misconceptions about parenting among same-sex couples and LGBT people in general. And this is a map of where same-sex couples are most likely to be married. And if you look at by county, and if you look at it really closely, it's the mirror image of the same-sex couple map. So it's really dark through the most conservative parts of the country, and it's less dark along the coast and in New England. And what that's about is that...
Could you just tell us, I'm sorry, one of the numbers, 32% of what is what?
That's 32% of same-sex couples who have a child in the house, child under 18 in the home.
And they're married or not married?
They're either. We don't know in these data whether they're married or unmarried, so it's just all same-sex couples.
So, I mean, your interpretation was that more same-sex couples have children in the conservative areas?
Among the couples who are there, proportionally more of them have children. So it's places where there are fewer same-sex couples, actually, but the couples that are there are more likely to have children. And what that's about is that, so here's the other graph I'll show you. The overall proportion of same-sex couples raising children has been declining since 2005, which is completely counter to this idea that we're in this big baby boom, where all these couples are having kids. But it's actually, the problem is that most of the kids of same-sex couples are from prior different sex relationships, children that they had while they were young, probably in different sex relationships that have now ended. That's more common in conservative parts of the country where people come out later in life. So even in the GSS, and these differences they are occasionally, they're like on the cusp of statistical significance. These are small samples, but there's other evidence to support this. But even in this small sample, you see that LGBT people have their first child at a younger age than non-LGBT people. And in fact, there's lots of studies that teen LGBT people, that being LGBT as a teen is a risk for unintended pregnancy. It's a risk factor for pregnancy. Because it's a time of distress, of psychological distress. People engage in risky behaviors, including sex without condoms and sex with whoever. And so both boys are more likely to father a child, and girls are more likely to get pregnant if they're LGBT as teenagers. So this isn't completely inconsistent with that literature. So a huge amount of the kids are essentially in step families, because these are kids from prior relationships, at least one of the parents probably now is in. But what's simultaneously happened is that even though this is going down, if you look at the adoption line, it's going way up, but it can't keep up. I mean, adoption is expensive, long, and as people are coming out earlier in life, and we have lots of evidence that that's happening, they're less likely to have these relationships earlier, they're less likely to have kids. So this number is starting to go down as a result. So this just looks at same-sex couples. So one of the interesting things, it's not surprising that female couples are more likely to have children than male couples, but it is interesting that already the married same-sex couples are way more likely to have kids than the unmarried ones. And that's actually not true in different sex couples. Married and unmarried different sex couples are about as likely to have kids now. But in same-sex couples, clearly there's something about marriage that's more, and given that I think most of this is selectivity bias as to who's getting married, because this is all marriages that have happened in the last few years mostly, I think that this is indicative of people with kids see feel like they want to get married and maybe perhaps perceive a need for marriage that's greater than the ones without kids.
How do you think about age when you have people changing identities and maybe their age from birth is not what's relevant, their age in the state is relevant?
Yeah.
Do you normally leave age out of it, or do you do a lot of age adjustment?
We can start to look at age cohort. So the interesting thing about same-sex couples, for instance, is that on average, same-sex couples are younger than their different sex counterparts because LGBT people tend to be younger because older people are way less out. But their relation, when you look at sort of start of relationship and things like that, tends to be it's a later date that people kind of initiate dating and relationships. And particularly in the marriage dating, you have to really it gets complicated because people couldn't get married before a certain point. So the people getting married are way older among LGBT people than non-LGBT people because there was this backlog of demand. So you just have to, I think in most of these I don't go down that path yet. In these are mostly to try to just show descriptive
But
stuff.
this is one of the things that's going on, is that very people
Yes.
are older than the unmarried.
Yes, that is one of the things, yes. Though these folks aren't substantially old, same-sex married couples aren't dramatically older yet than unmarried. I think that will change over time, but yes.
But just to comment on the difference between this contrast and the absence of contrast in heterosexual
Yeah.
couples. Not only have you got a pent-up demand for marriage here, which could be
Right.
really driving a lot of this, the other thing is that in an unmarried heterosexual couple, both parents typically will have a biological relationship with
Yes.
the child, and a legal relationship
And a legal
with the
one,
child as a consequence. Whereas these can be the only way to create
Right.
a legal
Exactly.
parent.
No, that's a very important point, yes. So this is showing the point that I made about adoption. So in same-sex couples, it's still married, unmarried, all. The majority of children are either biological or step children, which could be kids from artificial insemination, surrogacy, but I suspect that, again, that's reflecting that the vast majority are from prior different sex relationships. But you do see dramatically higher rates of adoption when you compare them to different sex couples. So 17% of kids in same-sex couples are adopted versus only 2% in different sex couples. So that, there's clearly a difference. The other interesting difference is that there's a lot of these kids who are something else in same-sex relationships, and that's going away amongst the ones who are married look more similar to different, and this is obviously dominated by married couples in that regard. So they're not as much living with their cousins or their siblings or their grandchildren among the married crowd. So this is just to have any adopted child now. That was the actual distribution of the children. This is if a couple has any adopted child. So 22% have at least one adopted child, much higher in married than unmarried. This is probably partly, as you'll see, the married couples and the same-sex couples have a lot more money, and so they can probably afford. Adoption so far has been limited in public adoption systems. So to the degree that this is disproportionately relative to different sex adoptions, private adoptions, you need more money.
Yeah, but a lot of same-sex women partners, one of them will have a child and the other will adopt it.
Right. Yes.
So it'd be nice
And we
to
don't
get
know,
that
yeah, and that's one of the problems with this. We don't necessarily know how people code that. So my prior would be that they probably code adoption when it's an adoption of a joint and they don't quite think of the adopted child just because it was a legal way to create it. They still think of that as their bio child, but I don't actually have, that's just my prior, I don't have great evidence for that.
So here we're not picking up people who are single but have children, either in same-sex or...
Right, these are all couples, yeah. These are all couples.
Or not, because in the census at ACS you can only
You don't-
identify
yeah.
couples.
And so, and I do want to, because we're done, I want to move along quick, just because I want to make just a couple other points. And it's about a third of LGBT people in general have ever had a child, but that's largely bisexuals. So bisexuals have children at rates similar to heterosexuals. It's gays and lesbians who, when they're single, are less likely to say they've had kids. And so again, this is just about that's the kind of perfect bio. And then these last two descriptive ones are just showing you that the married couples are economically economically advantaged. So if this is selection, the same-sex couples getting married are the much richer ones. So way higher median household income, way less poverty, more likely to own their home. That's also true among couples with kids, way higher, even more starkly higher household income, again, lower poverty, and also more delineation around
Age difference is not likely to explain all that.
No, it doesn't. You can't. I've done some regression with this, and it persists. The marriage thing is a really strong indicator of economic advantage in the same-sex couples, and it's a stronger. But although I mean, it's actually not as strong as with different-sex couples because it's enormous with different-sex couples, but it still is a very strong predictor. So the last little bit I want to talk about is, so how does this get translated into a courtroom? And I mentioned that the De Boer and Snyder, this is April and Jane, De Boer and Rouse, and this is 3 of their kids at the time. This was the first marriage trial. This went in as an adoption case. They wanted to change Michigan's adoption law, which limited joint adoption to only married couples. The judge said, I'm not going to do that. You have to challenge the marriage statute. So they said, no, all right, we have a marriage case. So, but unlike so that's why the focus of so much of this case was on parenting, because it originated as an adoption case. And they were really, the whole purpose of even getting married in this context was to be able to jointly adopt their kids. So they actually had 4 kids. Two of them were, one was mother to 2 children and the other was mother to the other 2. And the other mother had no legal relationship with the other 2 children, which creates a whole set of challenges in terms of health care and all kind of stuff. So the expert testimony, and the difference between this and the Prop 8 trial was that there was nobody on the anti-same-sex marriage side on the Prop 8 trial. There were no social scientists that appeared as expert witnesses in that trial. There wasn't anybody to do it. When that happened, conservatives basically mobilized and they found people, they found academics who were willing to do some work in this area. And so there were a set of social science scholars on both sides. The main combatants on the anti-same-sex marriage side were Mark Regnerus, who is a famous / infamous sociologist from Texas, Austin, that did a study. Joe Price, who's an economist at BYU, and Douglas Allen, who is an economist in British Columbia. I think it's at Simon Fraser. And then on the pro-same-sex marriage side, it was David Brzezinski, who's a psychologist who does adoption stuff, me, and Michael Rosenfeld, who's a sociologist at Stanford. And so one of the things that I think is difficult about particularly a court setting, although this is true of broad public discourse, but it just becomes so obvious to me in the court setting, is that in the courts, the emphasis is making an argument. So it's about an argument. It's convincing people of an argument. It's not really convincing you that I'm right. It's convincing you that I have the better argument, if that makes any sense. And so there's a high value placed on just assertion. You just assert things all the time. And they don't need to be explained. And in fact, one of the reasons why lawyers can't stand social scientists is that we're trained that the last 3 pages of every one of our papers goes into great detail about how we could be wrong about everything. Like all the ways that we might be wrong. We're trained to do that. At the end of the limitations section, the discussion and limitations. Lawyers hate that. They can't stand it, and they hate it in court because that section can be used to undermine your testimony. In the academic world, that gives you credibility because you've thought really through about how you might be wrong, or at least what the limitations of your findings are. They hate that in the courtroom. And the other thing, so then, is that there's a high value on provocative findings. And there's a high value on framing things provocatively, rather than looking at kind of causation and trying to sort through the kind of explanation. So after thinking about this, and I've thought about this a lot, and again, over cocktails we can talk more about the actual process of appearing as an expert witness, but a little bit after the trial, it occurred to me that in truth, all those scholars that I told you, the data that they used all shows the exact same thing, if you look at it from a scholarly standpoint. So Mark Rodnaris did this new family structure study. He put out a big paper that created all kinds of drama, and I won't get into all of that. But it showed negative outcomes for kids who claimed to have a parent who had had a same-sex relation. So these were young adults who were asked whether their parent had a same-sex sexual relationship before they were age 18. And those kids who said yes to that had all these bad outcomes compared to kids who lived largely with their married by their parents. But even though he had lots of information about their various transitions in life in terms of what kinds of parents they lived with, and he didn't take any of that into account in that study. So lots of other people now used his data. There's now 3 papers out that all looked at household stability and changes over life. And if you take that into account, it turns out that's explaining all the differences. That's far and away the huge explainer. And so the point is that you can't target the gender composition or the sexual orientation of the parent as the cause, because there's this other cause that wipes that out. The decennial census data, Rosenfeld in 2010 did a big paper in Demography showing that educational outcomes didn't differ between kids with same-sex parents and kids with different sex married parents. And he used a sample of only kids who had lived in the household for at least 5 years. And his whole idea there was that he wanted to be able to say that there was something about the composition of the parents that mattered because they had been there for 5 years. So if there were differences, it was plausible that the gender composition could explain it. But of course, there weren't differences. So Doug Allen and Joe Price, who were the 2 in the trial, they in 2013 said, well, that's just because you didn't use all the data. And when they used all the data, including people who hadn't lived for long periods of time with same-sex couples, they found big differences, and they found a different conclusion. But of course, they couldn't explain that it was related to how that related, why that wasn't just when you control for this, you get this outcome. And then the pièce de résistance is that Doug Allen does basically this same study using Canadian census data. He writes a paper that makes this claim, except that if you look, literally, I cannot believe this, but if you look in the appendix, he lists other regressions that he ran, and he ran a regression where, basically, like Rosenfeld, he controlled for whether they lived in the household for 5 years or more, and if he did that, all of his differences went away. So in his own paper, he made both arguments. He just didn't talk about this in the paper at all. And of course, he didn't talk about it in court except under cross-examination. So in court, this crowd all relied only on this framework for their argument. And on the other side, everybody relied on this framework for their argument. And it's weird, to say the least. Like, it's weird. And so it creates this, because there's no one necessarily vetting what the standard of good research is in a legal setting. It's all lawyers who aren't social scientists who are vetting what is right or wrong. So it's just a very, very odd circumstance. And I think we as if you want your work to be used in policy, it's not that I necessarily have great recommendations other than to understand that this is the dynamic in the policy world. And you just have to realize that you're going to be pushed to kind of present your work in ways that are completely counter to how you're trained. Because you're asked to present in these just very short snippet with no explanation.
Was there, I think I remember, did the ASA come out and said?
Yes, the ASA did a brief.
Does that carry at all, the idea
It did.
that, 90% of...
It did. It helped
Can you
convince
explain
the judge.
what this is.
So the American Sociological Association submitted an amicus brief in this case and some others, in which they summarized the research on parenting and concluded that kind of the bulk of the research definitively shows that, from what we know, that you can't, it basically argued that gender identity, or sexual orientation and gender composition of parents, there's no indication that that has a negative outcome on kids.
But if, my question is more broadly, like, if a group of scientists
Yes.
come to a conclusion, does that carry any weight?
Again, it depends on the judge. I mean, in the Michigan case, the judge very clearly said that held weight. But the truth is, Judge Scalia said there's a controversy over this. Because 3 people wrote 2.5 papers. That's literally the sum total of the papers on this. There's 2.5 papers. It was a Regnerus paper, an Allen paper, and this was a commentary. So I call that a half a paper. And that's the sum disagreement. And this is hardly the only set of papers on this side. I mean, there's not enormous, but there's a big literature. And so, but, Scalia said that means there's dissent. So it can depend. But the other thing I'll just say is, so how this got framed is as an argument of this no difference. So, is there no difference between kids with same-sex couples? Well, of course there's difference. Everybody observed there's difference. The issue isn't whether there's difference or not, it's what explains the differences. And that kind of framework never came out that directly in the court. It really came down to, like, are you going to side with the no difference or the difference side? And, the judge sided with the different side, so he sided with Rosenfeld, highly credible, gives great weight, convincingly shows. So he uses this kind of language. He's way less kind on Regnerus. He actually, the quotes around the word study are the judges, not mine. It's one of the most stinging judicial kind of, but it's interesting what he points out. He argues that it appears that the data were gathered not for a scholarly purpose, but to question a public debate, and that he gathered it like kind of knowing what the answer he wanted was, which was kind of true. I don't think that means his data aren't interesting and good. I actually think he collected some really good data. But he can't purport to have undertaken scholarly research, is what the judge said, which is stinging. And he had similar commentary for Price and Allen. They represent a fringe viewpoint rejected by the back. So this is where the ASA thing came in. It also didn't help that Regnerus's department actually issued a statement the day before his testimony. And they didn't just say he doesn't represent the views of the department. They went further and said basically his views are wrong. Like that the field doesn't agree.
Regnerus was the sociologist? Or
Yeah, so it was UT Austin's social department came out with that. Right, and apparently they didn't even know that it was the night before his testimony and he got eviscerated in cross. So the last little, and I am just about done, the last little thing I want to point out is what that trial did was that it is amazing. Here's the other thing. So despite all the litigation, that one trial completely changed the dynamic of the parenting argument around same-sex marriage. And it took it off the table. Because one judge said, this is bogus. Other judges believe him. Like it's how the system works. And so this is a case in Indiana, you'll know at the beginning, there's this assumption that everybody raises kids that are okay. This is one of my favorite lines, but he says, heterosexuals get drunk and pregnant producing unwanted children, their reward is allowed to marry. Homosexual couples don't produce unwanted children, their reward is to be denied the right to marry, go figure. But it took... Yes. This is a very conservative judge.
And look at his opening sentence.
Yes.
He wanted children by the carload.
Yes. But he's he's a Reagan appointee. The judge in the
Reagan's first choice before Boer.
Yes. Yeah, he was considered for the Supreme Court. And the judge in the prior case was a Reagan appointee as well. So then, this is my own little bragging here, it was mentioned earlier. So this was the statement from Justice Kennedy, but it gives you a sense of how the data finally got used, which is, and this is where I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of just visibility of these groups in data, because it really was. So first, you get the shades of the Michigan trial. All parties agreed that same-sex couples provide loving. So that argument was just taken off the table. But then he goes on to say, and it turns out there's all these studies who show that there's a lot of these couples, and it's powerful, that it's a powerful argument that gay and lesbian people can create loving and supporting families. So it's a real kind of evidence of that this work can, in fact, despite all the challenges of being, it can make a difference. And then that's April and Jane at their wedding with their legal team. So this is the judge who married them, who was also the judge in their trial, and that's Mary Bonato did the oral arguments in the Supreme Court, and then that's their and they're about to adopt their kids this week. It's supposed to go through this week. So that's it.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, time, let's take a few questions, yes.
Sorry, the previous slide, did you file a brief?
I filed an amicus brief, so
Is that okay? And does that change the dynamic later if you recall as a witness?
yeah, so we had a debate what to do with that, because it does put you on record. It's another source of things. And, but you know, we figured this is the case, like this is the one case, so we just kind of went forward on it. But it is interesting. Again, when you file an amicus brief, I can't with good conscience not say that look, there were some things you report in an amicus brief and some things you don't. You're siding with a side. You're trying to make a legal argument.
So you left those last 3 pages out?
Yes. I didn't talk about how potentially problematic the Census Bureau same-sex. I mean, I've been at the forefront of criticizing census same-sex couple data for decades, and that wasn't part of my brief. But it did come out in trial. In the trial, that was discussed a lot. That was like a geeky nightmare trying to listen to that testimony, because I had to explain false positive errors in a court, which is really weird. Yeah.
I have a short question and a slightly longer question. Perrin, is that Andy Perrin of Berkeley fame?
Yes.
He's got demography IT staff.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
The other goes to what you were just saying, I guess. That is, how do you think about the situation in which you want to do research on this topic, you want it to be good objective research, but you also have you have feelings about how you want it to come out,
Right.
which I think is extremely difficult.
It is. It's very difficult, and I think it requires you. Look, I believe quite strongly that I was successful in some of my efforts because first I maintained a level of academic credibility. So I made sure that I periodically published in peer-reviewed journals. I presented at academic conferences. I took the critiques of the academy into account in my work. But I think you also have, and this is what's hard when you're if you're in a tenure track position, none of this is, like in most research universities, this kind of work doesn't get you anywhere with tenure. So you do have to make a conscious decision of the pluses and minuses of going down this route if this is going to be a major focus of your work, because a lot of it is not going to get you kudos in the academy. And as I said, you do have to learn to kind of tame some of the ways in which you've been trained to talk about your work. You have to be able to. I combined the kind of more academic work with lots of kind of short policy pieces, kind of like this presentation, lots of just crosstabs, descriptive stuff. And it's not that I can't do regressions and stuff, but that helps to just kind of prompt discussions, and it prompts people to think about things. And in this world, that's what I'm trying to do.
Let me sharpen it. Suppose it had come out the way you didn't like, and what do you do?
Well, I mean, it has. Certainly, I've, like my percent of LGBT, that kind of work generally comes out in ways that people weren't happy about. The movement was not happy that so many kids were from prior different sex relationships. They embraced that only very late in the process. They did not like me talking about it. And I kept talking about it because I thought it was critical to understand.
Yeah.
And so I would challenge when they kept saying, there's a gay boom. I'm like, well, it's more complicated than that. So it's just, but I think, for me at least, I was able to come off as an honest broker. And that's what you have to kind of do. You have to kind of, so I was never comfortable with just completely, the only time where I would ever say that I in any way, quote, censored was in like an amicus brief, which I believe is for a particular purpose. I'm submitting that in support of a particular case. I'm going to make the arguments that I think are most salient and support my brief. If they want to find the bad stuff, it's out there, and I've published it, but that's their problem. I'm not going to lead them to that. But that's really the only context where I would say I did anything even remotely resembling that, where I,
Thank you.
yeah.
I have a related question that has to do with this contrast you were talking about, the arguments that hold sway in the legal context and then the academic being so different. I feel like the framing of this legal issue, the average difference between one family configuration and another, even if it came out that on average kids didn't do as well in same-sex couple families,
Right.
it could be because those families are discriminated against, or there's some stigma, or there is some small difference. But that doesn't mean that it should be illegal.
Right.
So I just wonder whether that was a part of this discussion.
It was.
I mean, it's just, the whole framework troubles me.
Yes, yeah, and it's another problem, because exactly that was the framework, and you know, in a human rights context, that seems weird that you're deciding who gets to get married based on some notion that the people currently getting married aren't judged on in terms of whether they, we know there's lots of people, we know the day they're getting married that they're going to be crappy parents. We can actually predict that for some circumstances, or at least that the kids are going to have challenges, whether or not they're good or bad parents. The kids are going to have challenges under certain circumstances, and we don't deny marriages based on that. And so, but look, again, it's this political system, and that was the argument that the polling up until only a few years ago showed that that was the hot button issue for people, that seeing gay couples raising kids, and the idea that their kids would talk about this in school and all of that stuff created all kinds of angst, and that, so as a political argument, it became powerful. So.
Okay, we have to stop here. So thank you very much, Gary.
You're very welcome.